you for having me. I really appreciate this. It's very eye-opening to sit here and hear all these conversations about selling stuff, which is something I don't really do a lot of, but it's been very informative. And you know, one thing when I was asked to do this by my friend Steve Hartman, who's sitting in the front of this room right now, who organized this event, I was a little bit worried because I don't really do product, don't know much about return on investment, but I do know a lot about voice and authenticity. And I've spoken to a lot of different groups over the years, high school kids, college kids, journalists, and I think I always had a great story to tell. I'm about 44 years old now, and I started in journalism as a kid who had been a football player at one point in college, had his knees blown out, had to find his way, and I went to work for a newspaper. And it was a great story. I used to always tell about this because it was an underdog story. I had no experience, fought my way into a job in the early 90s. And then I realized when Steve started talking to me about this event, I started to realize that story didn't matter anymore. Because really that story started in 2000 when I went to work for Sports Illustrated. I was 29 then, and at that point in my career, I thought I had done everything you could do. And I felt like I was working with the biggest magazine in the world as far as sports were concerned. I had worked in San Francisco for 4 or 5 years for the Examiner before the Chronicle, had merged with them, and I felt like I was going to a place that was very safe and secure. You know, in fact, I remember going to Sports Illustrated, and the first thing I was told by a guy who used to work in San Francisco was that, you know, the Chronicle and the Examiner are merging. A lot of people are getting laid off. Newspapers are dying. You're safe here. You know, you'll be happy here. Make plenty of money. We're not going anywhere. And around that same time, Sports Illustrated, or SI as we called it, had merged with America Online. And I thought, this is great. America Online is so big, so strong, so safe and secure. A year later, that same editor who told me that, I came into his office, he was boxing his stuff up. He was moving out. And the guy next to him was doing the same thing. Guys who'd been here forever. They were leaving, they'd been laid off because AOL, as great as it sounded, was an awful place to work with. And that was my first real lesson about the world we live in now. You know, you better know what you're doing. You better have a strategy that works. You better know who you're getting involved with. Because as soon as that whole thing happened, as soon as the AOL Time Warner merger went south, my whole life, my whole business plan, my whole dream changed dramatically. And I began to realize I had to sort of start looking at the world differently because print journalism, newspapers, even magazines, they were starting to change. They were starting to go away. And I remember a couple years later being at the Super Bowl with a friend of mine, a guy named Josh Elliott, who used to work for Good Morning America, now works for NBC Sports, and we were just young guys at SI trying to find our way, trying to advance in our careers. I looked at Rick Riley, who was a big-time columnist. He was the first guy in the history of journalism to make $1 million a year, and everybody wanted to be Rick Riley. I looked at Rick, and I told Josh, you know, man, there's this guy over at ESPN called Bill Simmons, named Bill Simmons. He's kind of getting a little following for himself. And he said, yeah, no, I checked him out a little bit, but you know, we see like Rick has got his thing going and we're at Sports Illustrated. I said, no man, it's like, you understand, like that guy there, Rick Riley, this 55-year-old middle-aged white guy, brilliant writer, like he's gonna be the last guy who makes a lot of money doing that, just that, writing on print, writing for print. He's like, you think? I said, no, trust me, I got a feeling about this. This is the way it's gonna go. We are seeing a huge shift here. And again, my world changed about 6 months later because Sports Illustrated decided they really wanted to get involved with their website. They really wanted to enhance their website. And up until that point, they didn't care about a website. They didn't care about online media. They didn't care about hits or clicks or page views or any of that kind of stuff because they felt as if they were king. They didn't need the internet. You would go in the offices of executives and they would say, you know, why are we doing this? Like, why are we worried about this stuff? How can we make money doing this? And I used to tell Josh, I said, look, man, don't listen to those people because this is our way up. This is our opportunity to to get a voice for ourselves, to make a way for ourselves. We don't have to wait in line and wait for all these old guys, these really talented, respected writers to do their thing. We're good. We can have a voice. We can do these things. And slowly but surely, we found our way onto the internet. We developed columns for ourselves. We got a big following. We didn't get a big following. We had big responses to our work. And for the first time, again, I had gone from a place where I had to wait for an opportunity, and I had to hope for a chance to rise up, to a place where I could just have immediate impact. And I felt as if this is what I've been waiting for. This is what I needed to see. And so I fast forward this story a couple more years, in 2005. And by that point, ESPN had become a lot stronger with their online presence. Their website was the best website around. And I had been discussing moving to ESPN, taking a job there doing TV and doing some writing online. And when I talked to people about this, they thought I was crazy. They thought there's no way you should leave a place like SI. They still had pensions. They still had great reach. Writing a cover story for SI was the biggest thing you could do in the business. And it scared me. It scared the hell out of me. I had a soon-to-be new wife. I was trying to start a life, possibly starting a family, and I was leaving a job where I was a secure, full-time person for a place where I was going to be an independent contractor. I was going to pay for my own health benefits, and it scared the shit out of me, to be honest with you. There was nothing about it that screamed sensible. But as I began to look at SI and what was happening there, I thought I had to do something. And in fact, I remember having a conference call with all the writers, great writers. I'm talking about Riley, Steve Russian, who was Sports Writer of the Year at one point, Tom Verducci, who was a brilliant baseball writer who called the World Series this past year, the all-star team of sports writers. And we sat on that conference call, and we talked about how we would approach the website, because it had become clear to all our management that it was time to make a change. It was time to really get involved with what was happening online. And up until that point, to give you another example of how far behind we were at that time, we would take all our worst editors, all the people who were this close to being fired or laid off, dumped, and we put them on the website. It was like the Australia of websites. Like that's where you went, you couldn't do anything. And we kind of scuffled along, and we didn't make much impact. Guys like me got to write, but they didn't really have a lot of talent over there. And so our editor at Sports Illustrated said, we want to have more of our writers go over there because we have great writers. If we get great writers over there, people will read more, we can do more things. And there was so much complaining. And this time it wasn't just from the higher ups, the people who'd been there for 30, 40 years. It was 25-year-old people, 35-year-old people saying, why are we doing this? Like, what are we getting out of this? What are we getting paid for this? And at that point I realized I gotta go to ESPN just because I'm gonna die here. Like, we had already hit the Titanic, we already hit the iceberg. We were just kind of waiting for the boat to go down. It may have been like 5, 10 years from now, 15, 20 years, but it was going down. And so I went to ESPN. This is where my story really got interesting, because I think as I thought about this discussion, the 3 most important things I'd learned about the online experience is, if you want to be successful, if you want to have a voice, you have to be first, you have to be different, and you have to have faith. And so I felt like I'm going to be the first one out of here. You better believe I'm going to be gone. I'm being different now. But the faith part kicked in when I got to Sports Illustrated, when I got to ESPN. Because the guy who brought me in, who ran TV shows, which is now called First Take, he got reassigned. And about a couple years later, the recession hit. And so all that money I was making going to ESPN kind of put me in a bad place, because I had no allies all of a sudden. I was making a lot of money. And then one day I got a call from the guy who replaced my old boss. And they said, you know what, Jeff, it's like, you're making a lot of money here. I don't know if we can keep you around. Like, we can maybe pay you about a third of what you're getting. That's the best we can do. We can do that for about a year. And so now I'm thinking, all that fear I had a couple years earlier when I had gone over there, well, that had come home to roost. And I was really staring at the abyss. And a lot of things happened in the course of those 12 months. The first thing being, my marriage went south, so that was really a lot of fun. The second thing that happened was I got a chance to actually talk to a lot of different different websites. A lot of people called and said, hey, we want you to come out and talk to us and see what you're doing so we can do for you. And as I went around to all these different websites, I won't name them specifically, what I saw was something that was even scarier than what I was going through, which was that all these websites were filled with people who had escaped newspapers and brought all their old ideas over there, all their old business models. And so when I would show up, I would think, how do you guys do business? How are you guys making things happen? It would just be, well, we're doing the best we can, we're trying this, we're trying that. We paid a bunch of people a bunch of money, it didn't work out. And nobody really had a plan, aside from the place that wasn't going to pay me much money. So I had to go back to ESPN. And I sat there for about 6 months just fuming, like struggling, crying at times, trying to figure out how I got into a place that was so scary and really dangerous. Drank a lot. Made some interesting moves. Talked about doing business at one point with Steve. And I think those 6 months taught me a lot about that third aspect of what I said was important for having an online influence, that faith. Because when we talk about developing a voice, I spent years trying to figure out what that meant. How to be authentic. We've heard that term a lot today. And as I went through the course of my career, I thought I was doing those things because I knew how to outline, I knew how to lay out a story, I knew how to get anecdotes, I knew how to do all these things, but I hadn't really experienced life. I hadn't really been challenged in the way that I had to be challenged. And I didn't know this when I was going through this with ESPN, by the way. I learned it about 6-7 years later. But that was the point in my life when I really had to decide, what's my voice going to be? And what's my impact going to be? And is this my time to decide, am I going to just run away and just, shrivel up because things got hard? Yeah, I've gone through some tough times, but hopefully this will pass. And I remember vividly, I think it was 2010, and I had gone to the Super Bowl. I paid my way. I used to go, all the frills, all the parties, all that stuff, and I had paid my way to Dallas. And I was sitting in a hotel room, the Residence Inn, and I was literally crying. I literally was in my hotel room crying, thinking about, I gotta go out here and I gotta make my career happen. And I gotta make this thing work because I did not go through all this stuff. I did not make all these gambles just to let it go away now. And so I got fortunate. The NFL Network came forward and made me an offer, and ESPN decided they want a counter offer. And I got a 4-year deal out of it, and I got back into it. But I think when I got back into it, my mindset was very different. It was very much about, I'm gonna be me. I'm gonna write the way I wanna write. I'm gonna attack this thing. I'm going to let all these experiences that I've gone through, not just the good stuff, because the good stuff's easy to write about. The good stuff is easy to call upon. But that hard stuff, that stuff when you're really uncertain about yourself. I mean, everybody in this room, I'm sure, is here because they took a risk. They wanted to see if they could blog, they wanted to see if they could build a business. And what comes with those kinds of gambles is those kinds of moments that I went through. But the beautiful thing about it is that it allows you to really get the resources you need to have a voice. And when you talk about being authentic, when I talk about what allows me to sit down with a Marshawn Lynch and get him to open up, a guy who can talk to anybody, to sit down with a Navarro Bowman or Patrick Willis or Stephen Curry, people I've interviewed over the course of my career, and to really reach them. It comes from that place of doubt. It comes from that place of fear. It comes from that place of pain. And I think that is something that, if I can offer anything to anybody in this room today, it's that knowledge that what you were going through, what you were trying to do will pay dividends far beyond just a check. You know, how do you build your voice? You build it through pain. You know, you become a better writer by living more. You become a better writer by calling on every last resource you have emotionally. You know, I just watched a great movie on HBO. It was okay, it wasn't great. It was called, it's called Bessie. It starred Queen Latifah, and it was about the story of Bessie Smith. There's a point in the movie where she's being taught about how to sing the blues by this woman who was like a big-time blues artist back in the early 20s. And she took Queen Latifah and she took her to the edge of the stage. And she says, here is where you stand, with your feet right off the edge. Because if you don't risk anything, they don't risk anything. And I always, when I heard that, it's like, that's kind of what my experience has been. You know, if you really want to have a voice, you have to risk something. And to risk something means not just doing it when you're, you know, trying to write a clever line to the page. It means every day of your life. It means every second. It means living through those pains, those painful experiences. It's funny, I look back now on my career, and I'm still excited to come to these kinds of places. You know, we were talking about this back in the video room, and somebody asked me about, you know, what you get out of coming to this kind of thing and talking to younger people. And I always tell them, it's like, well, I get offended sometimes when they say journalism is dying. And I get offended because journalism is not dying, it's just changing. You know, it was built on a bad business model a long time ago. I mean, newspapers were making 30% profits, you know, 30% return on investments, because they controlled everything. They dominated the communication marketplace. And then that went away. But also the problem with newspapers and magazines is that this whole business is built off reaction. You know, something happens, an ambulance goes by, a fire truck goes by, we chase it. Figure out what happened. Building blows up, we go down, ask questions. Not a lot of visionaries in this business. Not a lot of Steve Jobs walking around, you know, Mark Zuckerberg. But my hope is that somewhere in this room that person might exist. You know, or somewhere in this city, or somewhere on this coast, or somewhere in this country, or somewhere in this world. I talk to young people all the time, and I tell them, it's like, you have the power to change the way this is. You're the ones who were, you know, understanding social media in ways that all those people who I met on that road to try to figure out my contract a few years ago, you understand in ways those people don't. You can see it. You can see the world through a lens that's not available to people who are my age or older. And if you want to have it be different, if you want to make money doing this, you'll find a way. You know, I certainly don't think journalism is dead, and I certainly don't think it will ever be dead. There's too much of a demand for information. There's too much for demand. There's too much curiosity in the world. You know, I think the one thing that never changes about journalism is that people want to know what's happening. But I think what hasn't changed, and what I think people are here to do today and learn how to do, is that voices have to become more distinctive. I think there are a lot of great talents out in the world, blogging, you know, on social media. But I think there's too many people who just scream and shout and don't really say anything. If you want to say something, it starts here and starts here. And I think you really get there by taking chances. And so, I talked for like 15 minutes. I was going to talk for like 20. But I also was going to open this up to questions too for people. I can keep rambling. I think sometimes I'm better if you guys have things you want to ask me. And if you don't, we can go have a drink.
You mentioned Bill Simmons, and then you never came back to that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think I'm kind of like limited by what I can say about him, because he was just dismissed. But I think what he did I think two people really had a huge impact on where we are now as far as sports journalism online. Bill Simmons being one of them, and Peter King, who I work with at Sports Illustrated, being the other guy. And I'll start with Bill because Bill was a high school sports writer in the late 90s who couldn't get a job at the Boston Globe. And what he had going for him was a quirky sense of humor and a lot of courage. So he was able to find a job writing freelance columns for ESPN.com back in the late 90s when ESPN.com was really kind of more like a frat house for journalism. It was just anybody could go on there and write some funny stuff, some witty stuff. But he was able to tap into an audience that I think every advertiser in this country wants to reach. He was able to reach millennials. And he did it with a very witty, very off-the-cuff style. And ESPN, to his credit, realized we need to market this guy and sell this guy. 20 years ago, Bill Simmons would never have been heard of. I can promise you that. He wouldn't have gotten a job at Sports Illustrated, he wouldn't have gotten a job at the New York Times, the Boston Globe, because he would have lacked the patience to work in those places, but he also wouldn't have had people who would have been progressive enough and open-minded enough to let him operate outside the box, which to me is one of the great things about the internet in general. I think if you have a voice, a distinctive voice, it can be heard. You know, you don't have to have somebody, authorize you to do that. I think he's been able to build up a huge brand. But what I also tell people about Bill Simmons is that I've seen way too many people try to duplicate what he does. And like I said, succeeding online to me is being first, different, and having faith. And if you're not the first person to do what Bill Simmons did, then you're not going to have any success being the second person. I think we've seen that not just with online talents, but just websites in general. I think, AOL was big ones, MySpace was big ones, everything kind of is big for a minute, and then it goes away. But I mentioned Peter King because Peter King was in the same boat as, not the same boat, a similar boat. He was a guy going nowhere at Sports Illustrated in 1999, the year before I got there. They used to laugh at his copy. They didn't have any room to get him in the magazine. And being in the magazine back then meant you were stuck. And so one day an editor came to him and said, hey, we got this website, no one's really reading it. You have a bunch of information in your notebook. Why don't you go ahead and put that online and see what happens? So he did it. And he got a huge response. And then a few weeks went by, he kept doing it. And he got a bigger response. And then before you knew it, within 2 or 3 years, Monday Morning Quarterback, which featured Peter King, was a must read. And now it's like he's running his own website, and it's a huge thing, he's being paid millions of dollars, but again, he was first. And like Bill, he was different. And I'm sure both of those guys had to believe a lot in what they were doing because nobody gave it to them. They earned it.
Do you read Deadspin? And if so, what do you think of that site?
I do read Deadspin. I think to me it's evolved a lot over the years. Sometimes I think they've matured. I think early on they were too willing to go after anybody and to challenge anybody. And I think the hard part about journalism for me is that it's never really been, it's not like medicine or law where you get certified to do this. There's not a board of ethics over there saying, all right, you're a journalist now because you took this test or you spent this much time studying it. It's just like we can all be journalists today. You can all walk out the door tomorrow, go to the Middle East and try covering stuff and writing about it, and we can say we're journalists. The problem with that is that the ethics shifts, the integrity changes. Everything's malleable, And so I remember when I first started working in this business, an editor told me that a lot of people become journalists because they don't know what else they want to do with their lives. And the older I get, the more I think that's true. And so when I see Deadspin and see some things that happened early on with it, and it wasn't just them, other people would call people out online, they would, talk shit online about people. I don't like that kind of stuff just because I don't think that's not my style for one. But I think it's also like, I think if you're gonna do that kind of stuff, you also have to be willing to go do the hard stuff that come with being a journalist, like going and talking to people, you know, going and like seeing somebody whose whatever daughter's been killed, within hours of you visiting them. I think there are a lot of things that people do who are journalists that I really respect, and I think a lot of things that some people do online that I don't respect. But I think Deadspin has kind of grown up a lot for me.
So I'm from the South. Here we go.
I could hear you.
Okay, yeah. I'm from Georgia.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, man. I screwed you up.
That's okay. And
Big, massive fan of college sports and college football, but I've just been seeing the sort of struggle over compensation and the idea that can college athletes be compensated? And just thinking back to that creepy video that someone took of Todd Gurley signing autographs in the car. It was such a it makes you feel dirty looking at it, because here's an incredibly talented guy, and sure, he went to the NFL and he's going to get paid, but he really had no recourse to cash in on his skills, and an injury could have ended his career before he got to the NFL. And so I guess I'm rambling, but I don't want to ask you what the solution to that is, unless you have one offhand. But is there a solution to that? And
You asked me anyway.
no, is there a possible solution? Is there anything? Can we get to a place, hopefully in the next decade or so, where there's a fair system here? I don't know.
Well, I played football in college, and I had, unfortunately, a couple knee injuries that ended my career. I didn't come from an impoverished background, so I didn't really have that kind of experience to where, I was desperate for money. I went to school, a lot of guys who were that way. I saw kids coming to school with, a Foot Locker with all the clothes they had in their, the world in there. I saw kids who were struggling to get food on weekend nights when the train table was closed. I've always believed that a college education is a great deal. I've always believed that if you were to add up what it costs for the average kid to go to school, if you said that kid could go to school for free, in exchange he had to go play football or basketball, whatever it is, do the hours of practice, play the games, take the abuse of your body, I'm sure a lot of people would do it. I get the argument about the money and the compensation, but I tell people all the time, it's like, I'm pretty sure the average kid at Texas A&M couldn't go hang out with George Bush like Johnny Manziel could. I'm sure the average kid in Oklahoma couldn't just go into a big boosters dealership and just drive off in a car like Adrian Peterson once did. The connections you make, the access you have at that level is, people don't talk about that enough. I mean, people in this room are sitting here trying to network and trying to build a career. So I do get a little bit upset when the argument becomes very simplified and it becomes about, well, the NCAA is making this much money and the kids are only getting this much money. Last time I checked, the guy who made the iPod probably ain't getting paid as much money as Steve Jobs got paid. This is kind of how the way the world works. But I think my solution to it has always been, because there is a question there when people do finish their eligibility, that if they don't have the money to go back to school or the time, then they're screwed. What I would say is take all that money that's being made, or take a good chunk of it, and set it aside. And say, if you finish playing football or basketball, whatever, you can access that money, you can go back to school and finish your degree. And if you're in good standing, you got your degree when you're done playing, you want to go to grad school, you want to go to be a doctor, a lawyer, whatever, get your MBA, then you can apply, get some money, go do that. And then you have the opportunity to take, to feel like you've got something more out of that than you probably felt you were getting before. the argument you get into, the problem you get into with paying athletes is that, and I've seen this before, go walk into any college bookstore today, you're not gonna see like 90 football jerseys in there being sold, you're gonna see about 5. And so why am I paying the backup punter the same amount of money as I'm paying the quarterback? You know, doesn't make sense from a business standpoint. And if I wanna pay people, then I'm gonna start saying, well, you know what? You had 50 catches this year, you only had 30, the following year. Why are you still here? You know, there's a lot of things that people, again, don't want to get into because it's to me, it's a very complicated argument, a complicated conversation. And it's not just about rich and poor. It's about, a lot of other things that play into it. That's it? We're good? All right. Let's go have a drink.